Okay, so I feel like I could recap that because that's kind of a long and very complicated example, but that's sort of, I think, what tends to happen in Marxist theory. People are working together, surplus value is being created, and no one's being exploited. And this should be shown because although some people are subsisting off of these B bushels of corn that they've received from surplus value, they're still only receiving an equal amount as the other people, and everyone's still working the same amount as they would have if they weren't working together. So
Right.
going back to the other situation is not going to make anyone better off. And so, like, if someone's calling this exploitation, then it's sort of like exploitation has lost its fangs. Like, at this point, what's so bad about exploitation? For anyone just tuning in, I'm not saying exploitation isn't bad. I think it is bad.
I think what you mean is we're defanging surplus value. I think that's maybe what Tristan is going about, not so much exploitation, because we might have to give exploitation another definition, not in the realm of surplus value as like default of the same thing as exploitation, because maybe it's the case that we create surplus value and then say maybe we find ways to also redistribute it, or we say we find ways to invest in it to maybe lessen the workday or to distribute some new type of good or service. Now, I think that's a new question that we haven't addressed yet, and I think now I'm curious: does Romer address what to do with things like, say, surplus value or increased efficiency in production?
What Romer does with these arguments is he says, look, we shouldn't really focus on surplus value, and we shouldn't be really focusing on labor markets. But what the previous example sort of showed is that what we care about, or what our moral intuitions are about this case, is we care about who is better off if they withdraw from the economy. And that basically becomes his definition. He has a definition that relies on a hypothetical withdrawal from the economy that would make the exploited better off and the exploiter worse off. So here, the explicit formal definition is A exploits B if and only if, when B secedes from the economy with its share of resources, B is made better off and A becomes worse off.
Okay, so just to go over what you're doing here, you're providing the new sort of formulation of what constitutes exploitation, right?
Right.
So now that we've killed the old Marxism, this is sort of trying to erect the new Marxism.
Right, and Clay is right. There's a sense in which Romer's not really trying to ignore the entire discussion of exploitation, or he's not trying to say it's not important, but he's saying we should totally rethink it. And we should define exploitation in a better way. And this is where Romer gets really interesting, because he applies, so clearly this definition of withdrawing from an economy with its share of resources needs further explanation, because obviously our first question is, what's the fair share of resources, or what's the amount of resources that is importantly necessary for it to count as exploiting? And Romer makes three different definitions for three different types of societies. So he starts with feudal societies, and then he moves on to capitalist and socialist societies, and each type has its own kind of exploitation. So, for example, a feudal society involves exploitation if the exploited would be better off and the exploiter would be worse off if the exploited B would withdraw from the economy with A with its alienable resources. And that really just means its own labor power. So you can imagine if the serfs withdraw from the feudal relationship with the lord, they're just better off. I mean, they were slaves, right? So they didn't even own their own labor power. So if they were just able to withdraw from that relationship and escape the lord, they would just be better off, and they could work on their own land and use their own labor. But in a capitalist society, it's a bit different, right? Because the land is no longer the important thing, and labor is not really owned anymore. It's instead sold and hired. And what's important is the ownership of capital. So that's what people care in capitalist societies. So Romer says this implies a sort of higher standard. So in a capitalist society, exploitation happens if the exploited B withdraws from the economy with its inalienable resources, its labor, and a per capita share of the economy's alienable resources, which is capital, such as raw materials, tools, maybe money, and then the exploiter A becomes worse off. Finally, Romer believes that even in a socialist society, you could still have a kind of exploitation. And in a socialist society, exploitation would occur if essentially the exploited were able to withdraw with a per capita share of the alienable and alienable resources. So it's labor and a per capita share of raw materials, tools, and so on, but also its share of wages. And note that each of these definitions assumes that the previous one has been eliminated. So Romer assumes that we start with a feudal society, and when we move to a capitalist society, feudal exploitation has been eliminated, and when we move to a socialist society, capitalist exploitation has been eliminated, but each society still has its own type of exploitation. And in this sense, Romer is still following a sort of traditional Marxist line of thought, not with respect to that definition specifically, but with, I think, the notion of moving from feudalism to capitalism to socialism as a sort of series of stages in history strikes me as more traditionally Marxist.
Yeah, he's just abandoning that spooky, weird notion that it's predetermined or a law of nature. So given Romer's definition of exploitation and the fact that it occurs in all three types of societies that we're typically concerned with, feudal leading into capitalist, leading into socialist, all of them have the different types of exploitation. Does he even offer an answer for how to mitigate exploitation occurring in that final transformation, a socialist society?
Well, ultimately, Romer is not a socialist, and he's really a communist, and he thinks that ultimately the only just society is going to be where you distribute resources from ability to according to need, and there's absolutely no inequality in bargaining power, inequality in ownership of the means of production, and this kind of society has never existed. And so it's something that Romer thinks has to be achieved by going from feudalism to capitalism to socialism, and then to communism first. And
then in communism there will be no exploitation.
Right.
Even though, doesn't it seem a little weird? We're almost out of time here, but this brings up a really sort of seemingly devastating criticism of this view. Seems like I would be being exploited if my ability was being given to someone according to their need, despite my wishes.
Well, I would agree, but what Romer thinks is that if you're receiving an inadequate or an unequal amount of wages based on sort of talents that you have or something, you're actually exploiting the people who are untalented. And the reason, the sort of moral intuition behind this is something like what John Rawls talks about in The Theory of Justice, which is that your talents and your skills and your ambitions and your goals and so on, to some extent, they're based on morally arbitrary concerns. So, for instance, you might be really good at building, but that might just be because of genetic factors or lucky social circumstances that have nothing to do with any sort of moral merit.
Right, so no one earned their talent. They were just born with it, and so they shouldn't be able to wield it over other people as a bargaining tool. I see the argument there. Ultimately, I think I find that convincing in a way, and you don't. But that we should discuss that next week, because we'll have Tristan on again next week, because we're going to discuss ethics. And this is sort of an ethical question, I think. I think it reaches into those bounds. And ethics is, of course, foundational for political philosophy, which we're always concerned with. So these are some thoughts on Marxism, traditional versus analytical, non-BS Marxism, which, if I'm correct, Clay and I both sort of subscribe to. So, love us or hate us or want to talk to us, want to be on our show, anarchisthandbook@gmail.com.
Yep. Okay. So we want to thank Tristan for being on our show, and he'll be on again. And so you've been listening to the Anarchist Handbook with your hosts, Clay Norris
And Brian Moen.